for the Kennet catchment. And ARC has been going for nearly 30 years now, so it started off as an organisation lobbying, but has now diversified into a whole host of other things, including an awful lot of citizen science within the Kennet catchment, because clearly with lots of the practical projects we do, we want that underpinned with good data. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So the next slide will be, it's a map just showing for anyone who isn't familiar with the Kennet catchment, because we span Wiltshire and Berkshire. So we work not just on the Kennet, but obviously all the tributaries of the Kennet too. And if we can go on to the next slide, one of the first citizen science projects that we decided to do, this is just kind of a way of me trying to get across to you all the different things that we do now. But Riverfly Monitoring on the top right hand side was one of the first citizen science projects we took on board, which I was looking back through our data, which is now 14 years ago, that we started off with just a couple of people being trained to do a couple of riverfly sites. And anyone who isn't familiar with Riverfly Monitoring, if we go on to the next slide, please. It's where you train volunteers. This is just showing you that they're not riverfly monitoring in this shot. It's showing a lot of our practical habitat restoration, where we'll monitor as far as we can in advance and after to kind of see if there is an increase. But we riverfly monitor at sites that we're not doing any work on, because ideally we wanted to have as many sites in the catchment being checked on a regular basis, and riverfly monitoring gives us that data for checking for pollution of rivers. It's teaching volunteers how to carry out kick sampling. They learn how to do this. They have their own riverfly site, and that's the site they stick to, and they go out ideally on a monthly basis. If we go on to the next slide, please. Everyone's got the same riverfly monitoring kit, so the same size net and all the other bits and pieces, and they're taught to identify 8 indicator groups of invertebrates that don't tolerate poor water quality. So freshwater shrimp, 4 different types of mayfly, cased caddis and caseless caddis. And people are taught over a one-day, sorry, just being sidetracked by the question, over a one-day course. Now, over the COVID, we didn't run any courses. We carried on doing where people go out and shadow existing monitors to build up those skills, because I strongly believe that it's an awful lot for anyone to take in one day. It's really good to either support people in the lead up to the day by getting them to shadow existing monitors, or beyond that day to have support from myself and monitors, so that people's identification is actually really good, because there's no point in them going out and doing the monitoring and not actually correctly identifying those creatures that they're looking for. So like I said, we started off in the early days with a couple of sites, and over the years we've built that up to now having 62 sites in the Kennet catchment. And not all of them manage to get done every month, but because sometimes there is fish spawning, or if the river's too deep or too fast flowing, then it wouldn't be appropriate to get volunteers going out doing this. But we have a really good retention of volunteers, and generally they stick with it unless they're moving away from the area, because it's really nice to, one, it's something that you can do within the month when it suits you, and it's often we're putting people in pairs, so it's really nice to put like-minded people together, and we've had people develop strong friendships from doing the citizen science. And also it's because a lot of the Kennet is lots of lovely private fisheries, and all of them have pretty much agreed to let us have several riverfly sites at each fishery. So it's giving those volunteers lovely access to a really peaceful place that they normally wouldn't necessarily be able to go and visit. So it's a citizen science project that has brought in a lot of long-term data for us, and has also picked up pollution incidents as well, which would have otherwise gone undetected. If we could go on to the next slide, please, Jennifer. So this is just an example of some of the invertebrates that we're teaching volunteers to identify. The main picture are true mayfly, and then there's a picture of the cased caddis. So we don't need them to know which type of cased caddis or which type of caseless caddis. It's nice and basic and straightforward. They're just learning to recognise it's a case cabbis, and that is all they need to know. Some of our volunteers go on to want to find out more, and that's really good, but we don't want to off-put volunteers by putting too much on them. And the other picture of the little creature with the stripy legs is known as a blue-winged olive, or the volunteers know them as rockers, because when we're teaching the volunteers how to identify them, it's not only what they look like, but how they move are really good ways of getting people to accurately identify them. If we could go on to the next slide, please. I should have mentioned that Riverfly Monitoring is obviously part of a national initiative run by and overseen by the Riverfly Partnership. So all of our data, that if we have a trigger level breach, which is when the counting of the invertebrates goes into a scoring system, and if it goes below a certain number, that's a trigger level breach. And the first thing those volunteers must do is go out and resample again, in case it was a poor sample. If it's still a trigger level breach, they phone me, and I directly phone through to the Environment Agency, who are supposed to come out within 24 hours. But if there has been no trigger level breach, the volunteers themselves input their data into our own online system, and this is then once a month validated by me. I then share the records with TVERC, the Riverfly Partnership, the Environment Agency, the Wildlife Trust, and anybody else who would like to have a look at the data. So this map is just an example of the 62 sites. So on the left is our most upstream strike, which is as far up as you can go on the Kennet, pretty much, because if you go any further, it's really not, it's the winterbourne, and you wouldn't, it's either sometimes extremely dry, or then you don't get much invertebrate life of those indicator species that we're looking for, because the water isn't flowing all year round. And if we go all the way down to Reading, the Kennet's about 45 miles long. The gaps that are on that map are gaps because the river is not suitable to get monitors in. And then the ones where you've got a lot coming down diagonally, those are the River Lambourne. And then we've also got them on the River Ogg, the Enbourne, the Shalbourne, and the Dun. So all tributaries to the Kennet as well. And once a year, we have a kind of volunteer gathering for all our volunteers to try and get them all together and realise that they might be out in their ones and twos doing this citizen science, but actually they're part of a really big and important part of citizen science. So if we go on to the next slide, please. This was a recent Riverfly training day. So as I said, we didn't, in the worst parts of COVID, run Riverfly training, which we had our monitors. Our 62 sites were pretty much covered, but we like to run refreshers to make sure volunteers are still carrying out the kick sampling properly and they're still identifying creatures accurately, and to catch up with them as well. And so we had some new people wanting to be trained up, but we kind of held off until we could do all day in person again. And actually we're lucky that the fisheries on the Kennet, some of them let us host our Riverfly Monitoring workshops within their fishery, because then we've got a free venue, a really nice piece of chalk stream, and we chose the site with the biggest well-ventilated fishing hut, and the majority of the day was held outside. So it was great to kind of catch up with volunteers, old and new, and get them out, reassuring them that they are doing everything correct, and get more people trained up to fill the gaps. If we go into the next slide, please. That's just showing you the Abington fishing hut on the Kennet, and that was a group. We're lucky we've never had to buy our own microscopes. More the college kindly lend them to us for these events, and it's a way of getting people to really have a look close up at those invertebrates, so that their identification is good of them. And if we go on to the next slide, it shows outside of the fishing hut, which is where we were doing most of the day, in that river, the main channel there, and there's a little feeder stream behind the hut, and then having the trays outside so that people can really take their time to understand about riverfly and understand about how important these little creatures are in underpinning the whole ecosystem of any river, but particularly the importance of chalk streams. If we go on to the next slide, please. This is showing back in 2013 when two of our Riverfly monitors actually did pick up a really big pollution incident. They had gone down to their site, the water looked crystal clear as a healthy chalk stream should, lots of ranunculus growing, But as they took their sample and started putting it into their bucket and then in their tray to sort, it became apparent there was hardly any invertebrate life in that beautifully clear water, and what was there was either extremely lethargic or dead. They resampled, it was an even lower score, so even worse. And so they phoned me, I phoned the Environment Agency, they came out, they took samples, and it turned out to be an insecticide called chlorpyrifos that had somehow got into the watercourse. And because of knowing, we wanted to work out where had it come from, and although no one's ever been prosecuted, and when I say it came from the sewage treatment works, this is not a case where it was the sewage treatment works' fault, because they process sewage, not chemicals that people put down their sinks or their loo and so on. And this chemical is so toxic and obviously designed to kill insects and often used on land to get rid of leather jackets, that the Environment Agency estimate it was 2 teaspoonsful that wiped out the invertebrate life from Marlborough all the way down to the end Hungerford, which is about 9 miles worth of river of invertebrate life completely wiped out for a time. How this, even though we discovered it, we were able to the same day then deploy other Riverfly monitors up and downstream so that we could pinpoint where the pollution incident started and where the effects started to tail off. And then that constant monitoring every month afterwards enabled us to see how long it took for the invertebrate populations to recolonise, and we noticed there were changes for a number of months of the ratios had all kind of changed to what they normally were. And by us discovering the incident and reporting it, it actually meant that the sewage treatment works stopped discharging and prevented even more of this chemical coming out into the river. So it shows how important citizen science is of filling the kind of ever-increasing gaps of monitoring within the Environment Agency. So if we go on to the next slide, please. That's just showing you on the map. Sadly, the river doesn't show up particularly well, but to your left is kind of where the sewage treatment works are to the east of Marlborough, where you can see the borough part, and then it's point D where there were still effects downstream at Ramsbury, and then down to Chiltern Foliot, and then things kind of were starting to pick up again as you reach Hungerford, so going from Wiltshire into Berkshire. So that was that incident then. If we go on to the next slide, please. This just shows you the gamma, the freshwater shrimp numbers on these graphs. The graph to the left is Marlborough upstream of the pollution incidents, where the numbers naturally go up and down, but they're all kind of much higher. In those graphs, it says Stonebridge Lane, which is upstream of the sewage treatment works, but the numbers you can see are kind of just fluctuating, but if closer up, there's still a lot. And then you go to Ramsbury, which is downstream of the pollution incident, and where the arrow is in July. So you can see how high the numbers of shrimp were until you suddenly get that pollution and how they drop off and then gradually start to climb up again. And obviously, closest to the pollution incident recolonised very quickly because things were able to get downstream. But it was kind of in the middle of the pollution incident, from, that was where it took the longest for the numbers to build up again. If we go to the next slide, please. Then we've got Elkhot Mill, which was the site which is downstream of the sewage treatment works on the east of Marlborough. And that's just showing you their normal Riverfly, and then the arrow points to July 2013, when it suddenly went down to the Riverfly score of 4, and a trigger level is, if it goes below 5, so 4 is obviously a trigger level. And the numbers of going up to 12, that isn't how many creatures, that's just how the scoring mechanism works. And so having scores up around the 10 is a pretty good sight, and suddenly to go down to the 4 really was poor indeed. But you can see how it quickly, that site recovered, but further down took significantly longer to do so. If we go on to our next slide. Next slide, sorry. So this is just showing you that our volunteers get they're doing us a great job of getting in all this good, credible data. But this is some social media that our volunteers, some of them do themselves, just because they like sharing what they're out doing, which is a great way of publicising invertebrates, chalk streams and citizen science, and great that they are out there enjoying it. Some people with Riverfly monitoring, if we go on to the next slide, please, don't monitor at all in the winter because of fish spawning, and reds are trout nests or salmonid nests, and the arrow is pointing out, which you could forgive someone from not seeing and recognising a brown trout nest, an underwater nest full of fish eggs. We do carry on surveying through the winter because we have our volunteers trained to recognise these fish nests, and so if they know they're there, then they don't monitor and they just don't submit records that month. But because we know what we're looking for, there are sites that aren't good enough to have spawning fish, and therefore we can continue to monitor. If we go on to the next slide, please. We also do a lot of water vole surveying, and we share those with Julia Lofthouse from BBOUT. So even though some of our monitoring is in Wiltshire and she's primarily obviously Berkshire, she's still interested in our Wiltshire records as well as our Berkshire records, and something we have been able to continue to do through COVID, because you can socially distance water vole survey, is get volunteers out surveying for water voles. It's a really enjoyable activity, and we've now got the volunteers able to do the mapping themselves as well. And so as long as I've got someone who's a good mapper, we've got an in-date first aider, I'm now deploying our little water vole team out independently of me so that we can get greater coverage and do more water vole surveying each year. We're also, so we have sites we're doing, because it's, you know, we want to keep on monitoring whether the water vole population is still there. But equally, before we do any of our practical river restoration, we always water vole survey to know whether a project's going to be practical or if it has to be altered to take into account the presence of that mammal. We also have a number of mink rafts deployed along the Kennet and some of its tributaries to keep an eye on that, and we liaise closely with river keepers as well to know if there are mink around, and that's something we want to build upon as well. If I could go on to the next slide, please. That's just showing you what we're looking for when we're water vole surveying. If we're very lucky, seeing actual water vole, but fresh droppings and feeding stations, burrows, runs, tracks, latrines. And so this year we've had some really good numbers of presence of water vole found at the sites we've been doing, which is really encouraging. If we go on to the next slide, please. That's just an example of one of the volunteers who's our neatest mapper of water vole surveying. Mine I always have to come and redo when I get home. He stands there with his fine liner in the middle of the river and draws them like this from the off. And so this is really good data for us to look at if there's, you know, if the numbers are fluctuating, or we haven't had this yet, but if suddenly there were no signs at all at a site that historically was strong for water vole. So overall, the Kennet is doing really well, at least in the kind of upper and middle stretches to do with water vole. And when we're out and we're training volunteers, and sometimes at public sites, it's a great way of when people see you in the river and are asking what you're doing, to get them to, one, understand we're lucky enough to have this mammal, and two, when people who don't understand why they're in decline, to be able to communicate that tidy riverbanks are not good for a whole host of reasons, and to stop strimming and mowing habitat away. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is a site where we surveyed, and we pretty confident we weren't going to find any water voles on the River Dun, and so we then got funding in to do a project in the Dun Riverbank Restoration. And the picture on the right is 3 months after the river restoration, when it's a nice wild planted up riverbank, and a couple of months after that we went back with our broom poles and part of the vegetation and water vole evidence, freshwater vole evidence was there. We knew voles were upstream, we knew they were downstream, but they weren't at that stretch because it was being kept too tidy. So after working with the landowners, you know, we've transformed that piece of river, and it now I think looks much better, but it's good for water voles, it's better for the fly life, it's better for the fish, it's better for preventing bank erosion. So it was a real win. So that was a really nice project in Hungerford. Next slide, please. We've also, this was started last year, so I haven't submitted, well, the records have been submitted on Mammal Mapper app, so that's something I need to ask TVERC if you are able to access data from there. We discovered when we were doing, this is all hedging that's been planted in a water meadow that ARC own with the Kennet flowing through it, and we've got a conservation grazing area. So we've planted about 3,500 native trees of 12 different species around the conservation grazing area, and every autumn we just reduce the height because we've been trying to promote bushier growth. And we were doing that, and we inadvertently came across this little harvest mouse, and so it was photographed, put back again, and then I got in touch with the Wiltshire County recorder, because this was in Wiltshire, and he spent a day, if we go on to the next slide please, teaching myself and our volunteers how to harvest mouse nest survey, which I know is something that's being pushed a lot nationally by the Mammal Society this year. So we then harvest mouse nest surveyed the whole of this 15-acre water meadow, and discovered we actually had lots and lots of these harvest mouse nests. And this surveying is carried out in November, because by this time of year it is really unlikely those nests will still have any harvest mice in them. So that was a new kind of citizen science we've undertaken, of deploying the volunteers again with their broom poles for parting tussocks of grass, looking through our tall scrub area to find and map these presence of these nests. And that's something we'll be doing with volunteers again this autumn. If we go on to the next slide please. And so that was just showing that's how we have started putting in those nests, of doing it live while the volunteers are there, and just making sure they're not duplicating data. And that's just a nice specimen that one of the volunteers found of a nest there. So we're not only interested in the river, we're equally interested in surveying and working and doing citizen science on land also. If we could do next slide please. I put green solutions, wetland creators and habitat makers. So about 6 years ago we created this wetland that you can see in the picture, and the primary aim of it was to filter road surface runoff that was previously entering the Kennet and lowering the water quality. But there's been multiple additional benefits of creating that wetland, to having that still water body, and it was through doing the harvest mouse nest surveying, amongst the bits that obviously isn't the deep pools of water, we found that harvest mouse nests were all through all of that sedge. And so that was something we were completely unaware of until we did the citizen science surveying. We knew their water bowl had moved into it because we'd seen that, but and it's also a great resource that we use for doing pond dipping, to show children the difference between what lives in the river, what lives in the pond. So these kind of things all link up, which is really good. If we go on to the next slide, please. So this is a picture of a healthy bit of chalk stream River Kennet, and this was one of our very early Riverfly sites in Marlborough. But equally, that site we have found through doing the Riverfly monitoring has gone downhill, because what you can't see in that picture, we've put in an access area for people, because we believe you've got to give people access to the river, not all of it, but some of it, to be able to engage with it, enjoy it. Because we've Riverfly site monitored this site since before it had the public access, before beach area, we have seen the invertebrate numbers go down at that site, which kind of shows that there is a trade-off, and that's why you wouldn't want all of the river open to everybody all of the time. So yeah, so that there is a nice example of last summer, lovely bit of healthy river full of lots of invertebrates, and therefore full of lots of fish, kingfisher there, otter there, etc. If I show you the next slide, which leads into our water quality monitoring, that is a picture last year of the River Shalbourne, and that riverbed isn't looking very healthy. Something else that we do with volunteers, and it's kind of not as well regimented as our Riverfly monitoring, because it comes down to funding, but is whenever we have the funding to do it, is doing water quality testing for nitrate, phosphate and acidity.
1 minute. 1 minute left, sorry.
Okay, thank you. And so if we linking back to that slide about the wetland, the nitrate pictures shown here are actually what was done. One of them is the beginning of the wetland with the really high nitrate, and then the bottom slide of the nitrate is actually right at the end of the wetland before the water goes back into the river. So it shows about wetlands really can be a really good pollution filterer, which is not very well put, but you get the gist of what I mean. They really are cleaning that polluted water, that runoff that comes into the road. And we're trying to put more wetlands in to try and prevent saying thank you very much, and thank you so much for being patient with my lack of technological know-how. And the relevance of the eel behind me, if she has been swimming around, is we're doing a new citizen science project at the moment, which is called Obstakeels, which is training volunteers to go out with the River Obstacles app that's been modified. Volunteers are identifying obstacles to eels, because eels are struggling a lot because of barriers in rivers, and if we can get that rectified, it will help eels as well as a whole host of other species. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. That was good. Such a wide variety of things that you're doing in the catchment, and really interesting to see how all of that pulls together around those pollution incidents. Was really, really amazing. Actually, on the eel front, Lizzie was asking, do you take the eels into schools at all?
Until that's how I still have this eel, because it was a leftover eel from our project called Eels in School, which sadly we can't do that particular project anymore, because it used to involve tanks of eels going around, being put in schools, and then watching them develop from glass eels into elvers and so on. But we are no longer allowed to have the permits from the Environment Agency for releasing them in the river, because they've decided it skews their monitoring data on eels, which is a great shame, because it probably is one of the most exciting projects for going into a school and getting children to really care about and understand their river. But we know that we're not going to be allowed to do it anymore, but we are doing a different eel project, which no longer involves them having tanks of eels, but is still using the eel as an iconic species to engage children with their rivers.
Okay, thank you. And Brian was asking, are you still finding mink in the vole area? And Graham actually was also interested in how successful has the mink control been?
Mink control has been quite successful. The river keepers are very good at letting us know when they have dispatched minks, because they've got traps out all the time, because they're on site on their rivers and can check them several times a day. Sadly, we know that much further down, I'm based in Marlborough, but down in Reading, near Reading, I know there's somebody who's dispatched 10 mink this year, which is quite a lot for one area. So they're definitely still about and having to be controlled. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Alison was saying, is there anything that can be done to improve the access to the Kennet in the areas where there are gaps?
Improve as in getting more sites in the gaps. We've got a couple more sites that we're working on at the moment, but other than that, it's literally because the Kennet changes an awful lot, and you get to sites that literally would be over your head every month of the year. So literally, from a health and safety point of view, they're just not suitable for that type of monitoring, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And Henrietta was saying what a wonderful early warning system it is. And is this more widespread than the River Kennet?
Yeah, so the Riverfly Monitoring is part of, if people Google Riverfly Partnership. So it's a national initiative going on all over the country. And so, say in our area, in the Kennet catchment, are the hub for the Riverfly Partnership, Riverfly Monitoring. And I think South East Rivers Trust in London, they're a hub as well, and so on. But even if there is no one in your area as an accredited hub, there is nothing to stop people getting trained up and then starting being a monitor in their area, and they're able to directly input their data with the Riverfly Partnership. So do visit their site. And also the other week I was training, because I'm an accredited tutor, so I was training a person to be able to train one of the wildlife trusts, so they have now got their own tutor. So I know there's a map with, there's an awful lot of sites all over the country. So if it's something you're interested in, definitely see if there's already a group in your area, or if not, perhaps try to start, because it's lots of incidents have been picked up by this methodology.
Okay, thank you for that, and thanks for answering those questions. Really interesting to see what you guys have been up to. Very great example, I think, of citizen science.